Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Invest Africa. I'm Bronwyn Nielsen. Now, resources including oil and gas have played a vital role in widening positive investor sentiment in Africa, and it's becoming increasingly evident that Africa is not only endowed with mineral wealth but with energy wealth as well. On this episode of the show, we delve deeper into the oil and gas sectors on the African continent.
The majority of oil and gas reserves are dominated by 6 countries, namely Nigeria, Libya, Algeria, Angola, Sudan and Egypt. African countries are significant producers of oil and gas, and the new discoveries of these resources have helped trap investment and have become one of the key contributors to the continent's economic growth. Ghana has joined the continent's oil-producing countries, with daily production averaging at around 70,000 barrels per day from the 2 billion barrel Jubilee offshore field. Landlocked Niger also commenced its first oil production of around 20,000 barrels per day at the Chinese National Petroleum Company Oil in October last year. Output from new producers, however, still trails behind sub-Saharan African giant producers such as Angola and Nigeria. Gas is globally the fastest growing fossil fuel, and discoveries in Mozambique and Tanzania are positioning the East African region as a new gas frontier. According to the International Energy Agency, a 25% production growth over the next 5 years is predicted. Gas is forecasted to emerge as a crucial source of energy for both local use and to meet export demand in Africa. Africa's west coast holds 32% of natural gas reserves, and potential liquefied natural gas, or LNG, projects in places like Tanzania could open up export markets to the Middle East and Asia. Increases in gas production between now and 2015 are anticipated to be driven by LNG exports. But Africa's gas exports face a new challenge. Demand for LNG from North America could threaten the long term as a result of growing shale gas production in the US. This surge of unconventional production in North America has already driven gas prices down, which has prompted Angola's state oil firm, Son Angola, to tap into the Asian market. For now, infrastructural limitations, uncompetitive gas pricing, and the capital-intensive nature of gas projects have kept large-scale gas investments limited to a handful of African countries, even though gas is important to Africa's overall energy mix.
Joining me in the studio to take a closer look at Africa's oil and gas sectors, Bradley Surf, Vice President Operations, SAC Oil, Rajan Reddy, CEO of KZN Oil, and joining us from our bureau in Lagos, George Ashahan. He's the CEO of GeoConcept Technical Limited. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me. I think perhaps let's start, Rajan, with taking a step back.
Yes.
With the discovery of oil, for instance.
Yes.
Let's start with oil and then isolate gas into a conversation a little later in the program.
Yes.
What happens?
Well, there's different aspects to oil as such, you know, and you'll get the upstream, and that's what my colleague will chat about on the upstream, where you sort of drill for oil and crude oil. And where I belong is more the downstream, where it actually gets to deal with finished items and then into the market, and from the storage and refinery and out into the service stations.
So it's appropriate then to start on the upstream. Perhaps you can take us through the actual discovery, the exploration, and then obviously it goes through into downstream. George, we're coming to you in Lagos in just a moment. Bradley.
Yes, typically what's important is the exploration phase. So companies spend a lot of time exploring for oil. You need to understand whether the area that you're exploring for has commercial quantities of oil and gas. Once you find these commercial quantities, you then go into production, and from the production you then offload it and take it off to refineries.
George, we know what the discovery of oil has done for the Nigerian economy, and so too for the Ghanaian economy, and just in terms of where we're going with the oil sector, do you see it continuing to be a highlight of the Nigerian economy for many, many years to come?
Well, I think not just Nigeria is going to be like that for most of the countries in West Africa. If you see what's been happening in the last few years, you see Ghana coming on strong. There's been discovery of oil in Liberia, The same thing in Sierra Leone. And so many companies, especially the independents, they are very, very active in the west coast of Africa. And for Nigeria, up to now, oil and gas is still the mainstay of our economy. And we think in the short to medium term, it's going to remain like that until the government is able to diversify the economy such that oil and gas plays less role in determining the bulk of the budget for allocation from year to year.
Bradley, when it comes to exploration, do you see many more countries coming to the fore with oil and gas discoveries? You look at Mozambique recently.
Yes, certainly in Africa, from about 2000 to present, a third of the new resources that were added worldwide came from Africa. So there's quite a lot of areas that have opened up. As we've heard, the Gulf of Guinea has typically been has been very active in terms of oil and gas exploration. Now, certainly with the gas on the East Coast, the East Coast now is becoming more important from an exploration point of view, as well as we're looking at the African rift basins now in Uganda, the DRC, Tanzania, and then even Kenya, as well as Ethiopia, is now also becoming a bit more involved in exploration.
Rajan, how efficient are we when it comes to the downstream part of this equation?
We've always been extremely efficient in our country, you know. Sadly, we cannot say that for the rest of Africa to a large extent. Their refineries haven't been working to full capacity. So it's sad that at times they would actually have crude oil at their availability, but their refineries are either down. But coming to South Africa, we've always been very efficient, but even though our refineries, most of them are old now. And now we're getting into 2017 for cleaner burning fuels. So that's going to pose a huge challenge with the DOE, working with the refineries and getting them up to speed. So there is talks with our refineries, and I think they are coming to the party, but it's going to take a lot of revamping and to make us compliant for the Euro 5 standards, and where we have issues like that, yes.
Staying with the refineries, George, back to you in Lagos. Do you think we're going to see more money being driven into upgrading refineries in West Africa?
Well, I think so. Right now, Nigeria doesn't seem to be pulling its weight when it comes to the refineries, but that's going to be something in the past. If and when the refineries are getting an uplift, we were told that they're going to spend about $1.6 billion fixing the 4 refineries we have in Nigeria. Don't forget that recently, Niger Republic set up a refinery, and they're even sending their products to Nigeria. We are told that even Guinea-Conakry is going to set up a refinery. So by and large, most of the countries in West Africa will realize that it's in their interest to set up active and efficient refineries rather than rely completely on imports.
How are the Chinese and Indian territories dealing with perhaps the upgrading of infrastructure when it comes to the refining of oil? Surely they're jumping the gun and seeing this as an opportunity. Do you have any thoughts on that, Bradley?
Yes, certainly from a infrastructure and oil and specifically gas infrastructure development, the Chinese and Indian companies have been very active in terms of pipelines in Africa. The pipelines in West Africa, as well as potential pipelines in East Africa. The Chinese companies and Indian companies are certainly getting involved in these infrastructure development projects.
And how are they competing with the likes of yourselves, Rajan?
I think we need to be not trigger happy, as we would say. Our dream should not be to own a refinery if it does not meet the economies of scale. So let's not get carried away with having a refinery, and whether you also produce crude. Because if you look at the Chinese refineries, if you look at the Indians, their refineries, they are up on 600, 700, 800,000 barrels a day processing. While we, at a very smaller level, I think PetroSA is maybe 40, 50,000 barrels a day.
So let's not get ahead of ourselves in the conversation, is what you're saying.
Yes, and I think if you got to look at efficiency now, And I think that is something we really got to be mindful, because our other refinery is also not producing, processing huge. You know, they average about 100,000, some 120,000 barrels a day, yes.
George, back to you in Lagos. When we look at political risks associated with oil and gas discoveries, how firm are they on the agenda when it comes to talking about the oil and gas sector?
Well, it will always come in the fore when companies are trying to analyze the political risk. But then, I think in most parts of Africa, we've had all manners of political situations. If you recall, in Angola, when the war was raging, Chevron was there producing crude oil. And I don't think too many companies really will shy away, because when there are challenges, that's when you actually make a good profit. And I think quite a number of foreign companies coming to Africa have realized that some of these issues are part and parcel of doing business in Africa.
We're going for a quick commercial break. More on Invest Africa when we return. Stay tuned. You're watching CNBC Africa. Welcome back to Invest Africa. Now, Africa's thousands of barrels in reserves, untapped markets and generally benign regulation in comparison to the tightening regulatory environment in the West has seen major independent explorers and indigenous companies lining up to exploit oil and gas exploration on the continent. Let's take a look.
The oil and gas industry has faced a number of challenges over the last few years, including the global recession, the throes of the Arab Spring, and the consequent disruption to Libyan oil supplies. Despite all the hurdles, recent discoveries have made competition stiff between oil and gas exploration companies.
As a result of the discovery that we had over the last 2-3 years, there is a major competition between the major players in the oil business for acreage in Mozambique. We think that this is a good opportunity for Mozambique also to take advantage of the risk money that is available from those players to maximize the evaluation of our petroleum potential.
The continent's energy potential is blossoming at a time when global demand is rising faster than new discoveries. But oil and gas exploration for any company or country entails having the correct infrastructure, proper distribution channels, and being able to maintain these structures. Global uncertainties have prompted countries to start looking into securing their own steady supply of oil and gas.
It is responsible to ensure the security of supply of petroleum products in the country. As you would know, for the past couple of years and going forward, the supply-demand balance has shifted. We used to be before in export mode, but we're now currently in import mode. And it is extremely important that we have that reliability. I mean, we put full reliability of the liquid fuels in the hands of a national oil company. That way we are able to have an influence as well on the market and on policy issues.
The phasing out of fuel subsidies in many African countries in response to sustained fiscal pressures on governments and the disincentives they create for future investors is one way governments can influence investor behavior through regulatory laws and policies.
It's important to have a legal framework that is predictable, it's transparent, and to be able to create an enabling environment for companies to invest.
At current production levels, there are at least 40 years of reserves remaining in sub-Saharan Africa. However, if not managed in a sustainable manner and good governance goals trail behind the commercial imperatives that drive oil and gas investments on the continent, then oil may remain a sticky endeavor for years to come. Tumisho Mahanyele, Johannesburg.
Still with me in studio, Bradley Surf, Vice President Operations SAC Oil, Rajen Reddy, CEO KZN Oil, and from our bureau in Lagos, George Oshahan, CEO of GeoConcept Technical Limited. Let's come back to the political risk and your thoughts on that front, Rajen.
It's a very sad state of affairs for Africa. I think we haven't enjoyed the full benefits of the product, and it hasn't stimulated the economic growth that we should have enjoyed. I'm hoping one day that the politicians will get their act together, and that we will understand what is the benefit of the whole value chain, and that we'll properly utilize this wonderful resource. And we can also, because this is a base for all your costs. It's the most strategic product in the country. And when you get your costing wrong, it just cascades. It has a domino effect throughout the whole value chain. And that's why I said it's extremely sad that we will, export our crude oil, and then we will import our finished products at astronomical prices. And it's just blatant, abuse at times. And I'm just hoping that the politicians would really get their act together.
Let's talk about gas and how we need to get the energy mix right as well. Bradley, your thoughts on that front?
Certainly, oil has matured in Africa. Africa's been producing oil since the 50s, the 1960s. Gas is certainly making inroads into that in terms of the energy mix. And as we've seen within the last few years, a lot of countries have found large deposits of natural gas. What needs to happen now is natural gas, depending on how large the accumulation is, tends to get used where you find it. So if you find small quantities of gas, you need to use it where you find it. If it's medium to large resources, you can then put that in, you can use fancy technology like LNG, and you can take it to the Far East or to the US as well. But the US, because of the shale gas issue, is becoming less reliant on LNG. So countries in Africa, they will need to work together in terms of regional cooperation, regional blocks, to try and monetize natural gas within Africa. Also, there's also the gas outs. If you look at Nigeria, Angola, where companies are being required to flare less gas associated with their oil production. So certainly in the long term, gas is definitely going to be more prominent in the energy mix.
George, are we seeing that regional cooperation in West Africa when it comes to monetizing gas?
We've seen a bit of that. Recently, Nigeria sent part of its gas to the West African countries, Ghana, Togo, Republic of Benin, via the so-called West African gas pipeline system. And that hasn't been too successful, apparently because the delivery of gas has been short of expectation. But obviously there have been other areas of cooperation, like I did indicate that Niger is sending part of its product to Nigeria. And I do agree with my colleague that we need to have better ways of utilizing our crude oil, our natural gas resources locally, rather than export the crude oil and wait for high-cost products.
How does this impact you in the downstream environment?
Well, I think we are more suited, on the refining of crude oil, and maybe with the revenues, and then bring in the supply of gas. And so I think Europe and places like that, they're much more sophisticated for the usage of gas, and because of the environment and the climatic conditions, I think. But basically, we are set up for crude processing. So I think let us exploit that fair enough, and then side by side bring in gas. But you need the resources in the form of revenue. So I think, again, let us not get too much ahead of ourselves, and let us do what we can afford.
How long before Africa becomes proficient in terms of utilizing, monetizing gas resources?
Well, I think it's probably within the next 5 to 10 years. Certainly, gas would require infrastructure, investment in infrastructure. Certainly, in the past, companies were not looking for gas. They were looking for crude oil because the infrastructure is there. Now what we're seeing is people actually investing exploration dollars in finding gas.
And George, in terms of what we're seeing in West Africa, are we seeing money being put in on the ground to exploiting the gas story?
Well, I think basically most companies will look for oil first, just like it was said, because of the large amount of money you require for infrastructure development for gas. Not too many companies and countries have such infrastructure for gas. So everybody wants oil first. From monetizing oil, you can then develop your infrastructure required for gas. And I think that is where most companies and countries are going. If you look at Ghana, they focus mainly on developing and producing Jubilee Field and several other discoveries before worrying about gas. And you remember that ENI made some huge discoveries of gas in Ghana recently, but I don't think there's any plan to monetize that in the immediate.
Now, the oil price, considering you are KZ in oil, you must spend some time with the economists in terms of where this oil price is going at the moment. Brent crude hovering around $113 a barrel there and thereabouts. Do you think that that is a fair floor? Or do we see oil, and obviously we're not hoping that this will happen, but coming back down to that calamitous level of around $40 a barrel when we saw the height of the financial crisis?
You know, that question...
You're going to leave to the economists.
Not really. There is so much of emotion and political, input into that, which is not based on common sense in the pricing of the product. I think I've said this once before, that it's a free product. You get it from the ground. It is just the cost of logistics that you got to factor in. So the product itself you don't manufacture. And yet, when the US, sneezes and someone else
everybody
gets,
else catches a cold.
And if someone has to get pneumonia, then you're going to have, huge problems. So there is no science. Let's not even go into rocket science with this, yes. And it's really sad. It really impacts on the poorer countries. And especially when you use this, you base your economy on it. And every single thing becomes very expensive. So we really need to relook at this, because it's manipulated. It's manipulated from the top to the bottom. Make no mistake about that.
What about the fact that there are many out there? Well, there is a finite supply of oil globally. Is that going to happen in our lifetime, that we run out of oil?
I don't think we'll run out of oil. I think we'll just move to different sources of energy. Like gas will probably become a more prominent source of energy within Africa. If you look at Africa, 53 countries currently, 38 countries import energy. They net importers of energy. So certainly with gas being more workable and exploration focused on gas, a lot of those countries will soon become potentially exporters of energy.
George, in Nigeria, West Africa, the most exciting thought you can leave us with on the oil and gas front, sir?
Well, with the spate of activities in West Africa, I think the focus will still be on oil on the short term. Maybe on the longer term it's going to be gas, because there's going to be some change, especially with gas coming from different sources. But I think in the short run it's going to be essentially oil, because it's easier to monetize.
Well, that's all we have time for on this edition of Invest Africa. We'll be back again at the same time. Until next week, from me, Bronwyn Nielsen, and my guests, it's goodbye.